Now, we've been in the book of Joshua. Today we're in the book of Joshua chapter 4. And the name of this sermon is Don't Forget. And we're going to be talking about not forgetting things that are important in our lives. And the Lord made us, and the Lord understands how we are. He understands the way we tend to forget things that He has done for us. And if you read your Bible, especially the Old Testament, you see over and over and over again that God does some incredible things for people, and not more than a few weeks pass and they're complaining again that like they just forgot everything He did. And you just see that pattern going on and on through the Old Testament. God does a great thing, they forget. God does another great thing, they forget. Until He gets a little frustrated with them because they never seem to remember anything that He did for us. And today we're going to talk a little bit about that because God knows our human nature. And our human nature is to forget the good things of God when we have trouble, when it should be just the opposite. When we have problems, we should be remembering all the good things He's done and feeling like, wow, He's going to come through for me again because He did the first time or the last time. But people, human nature is that we feel sorry for ourselves and we get all depressed and we forget how many times God has brought us through. And God knows our human nature. So He's talked to us about that many times. And with Moses, He said this to them. He said, take care lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. He said, don't forget, you guys, when you were in Egypt, you were slaves. You remember one time they said, oh, it was better back in Egypt. Maybe you remember the Keith Green song, So You Want to Go Back to Egypt. Pretty funny song, but the whole song was about them forgetting about how good it was after they got out of Egypt, where they were slaves and had so many horrible things they had to do all the time. So God talks to us in this chapter about memorials. And when we talk about memorial, the word in the Hebrew means to remember. A memorial is to remember. So we have memorials to people. You go to Washington, D.C., there's memorials everywhere to all the presidents and generals and stuff. We have local memorials to great people. Cemeteries are full of things and memorials. We have a lot of things that we do to remember events, don't we? All over the place. All our countries, everywhere we go, that's true. Why? Because man tends to forget. And we need to be reminded often that great things have happened. God has moved. Men have done great things, achievements, and we will forget if we don't have a memorial. And at Mount Sinai, God told Moses to build an altar of stones. And this was a pile of stones they would make that would stand out while you're walking through the land. We would know that stones would not be piled up like that naturally, and we would know that these stones have significance, that they are a memorial to something. I don't know if they wrote things on the stones so people come later could see what the reason was, but there were memorials they put up so the people, when they passed, would not forget what God had done. And we started this with Moses. And in the book of Joshua, we're going to see that God continues this idea and this trend, and it becomes an important thing that God asks His people to do that. So let's continue on here and look at Joshua 4:1. It said, when all the nations had finished passing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, God stopped and spoke to the people. You know, we have to understand that God doesn't want us floating by wondering, oh, what does God want me to do? You know, God would love to speak to us if we would listen. God would like to give us instructions if we would read them in our Bible, if we would pay attention to what He's taught us and what we've heard in church. God wants to speak to His people. And so He said to Joshua, it says here, that He spoke to him. And this is His instructions. He said, take 12 men from the people, from each tribe a man, and command them, saying, take 12 stones from here out of the midst of the Jordan, from the very place where the priest's feet stood firmly, and bring them over with you and lay them down in the place where you lodge tonight. Then Joshua called the 12 men from the people of Israel whom he had appointed, a man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, "Pass on before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and take up each of you a stone upon his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel." So according to these verses we just read, Joshua was to choose 12 men. He had chosen these men before, and they were to take these people back to where the priest was standing in the middle of the river holding the Ark of the Covenant. And each of these 12 men were to pick up a really large rock, I suppose as big as they could, or a stone from the middle of the Jordan River. They were to pick up that rock, and they were to take it over to the side of the river. And there they were going to place that. And Israel would camp there in the land of Canaan. Now let's look at 3 reasons why he asked these men to do that. First of all, is a time of remembering what God has done. Verse 7, it says, "So these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever." So these were memorials, these stones, to remind the people what God had done, of their own personal experiences, what they had seen as God opened we saw last week, God opened the water for them. They walked across the river, such as he had done with Moses. And he opened the Jordan River, and they walked across with the Ark of the Covenant. And so they're taking these memorial stones to remember what God has done for them. In verse 6, there's a question. The question was, what do these stones mean to you? Sort of like going to school, and the teacher asks you a question. Why? What does this mean to you? Explain. And God asked them, what do these stones mean to you? These stones were very important. These stones tell a story. These stones tell a story of the person's personal experience. What they saw, what they heard, what they felt. As Christians, we need to do the same thing. I've told you many times that it's good to write down your answers to prayer. It's good to remember what God has done in your life. You need to have your story. Because when you witness, you just tell your story. When you tell somebody about God, you tell your story. What has he done for you? But you have to remember what he's done for you. You have to have a memorial. You have to have something that you cling on to, that you remember. So when it's time to tell your story, you can do it. There's just too many people that tell me, I can't witness. I can't tell anybody about God. I don't know how to tell a person how to find Christ as their Savior. And the simple answer is, you have to tell them what you did, what you learned, what you knew, what you found when you found Christ. You need to be able to tell them the same thing. Keep on telling your story. Never lose the sense of awe and wonder about what Christ has done for you. You need to keep a clear memory in your mind of everything he has done for you in your life. And you keep telling those stories. The most tribes, most native people, as well as the Jews, had what we call oral history, where they told the stories of their family over and over. That's how they could remember the ages of what happened and the lineage of the people, who begat who gave birth to whom. And there were oral traditions. And we have American Indians who can go back hundreds of years and give their oral history of what they remember. Perhaps in your family you can go back a ways. We've kind of lost it. We tend to write it down now, genealogies. But people remembered what happened in their lives. They remembered what God had done in their families. And the Bible does that over and over and over. It tells us the stories of what God has done for us. So I want to ask you a question this morning. What kind of memorials have you set up in your life? What kind of memorial, what kind of memories are you leaving to your children? What kind of memories are you going to leave to your future children if you don't have any yet? What are you going to tell them about your life? When you go back and explain and talk about your life, do you have things to talk about with pride of what God has done for you? Are they going to be memorials of shame and hurt and bad mistakes? Because we can build wonderful godly memorials, or we can build very unhappy and sad memorials, depending on the choices we make in this life. What is your memorial that you're building? What will your children say about you when you're gone? How will they remember you? There are memories of places that will remind you something happened in a certain place in your life. Places that trigger a memory. This place was called Gilgal, where they were. I looked back, and I was going to put a picture up. I forgot to get it this morning. I grew up in a little church. It was called La Mirada, but it was really Whittier, on Tedford Drive. And the little church I grew up in was a converted house. They had taken a house and they had opened it up and they had made it into a church. The living room and probably a dining room had been turned into the sanctuary. It was the only church I ever saw with a bathtub in the bathroom, in the church bathroom, had a bathtub. And bedrooms were Sunday school rooms. It wasn't really a big house. But we pushed 100 in there sometimes. And I grew up in that church, and I have such precious memories of the place. I still like to drive by it. To me, it's a very weird-looking house again. It's strange looking, but to me, I see the church that was there. I still see the little parking lot that could hold 6 cars in the front. It's just a precious thing. I remember the neighbor sitting out next to the piano player, right next to the piano. I remember the neighbor would open his window, and the church window would be open. We didn't have any air conditioning, and he would be like this on the window listening to the pastor preach and listening to the music. You could see his elbow. He never came in, not once, but he listened every Sunday, and he loved the music. Wouldn't come in. Hope he got saved from what he heard. I remember the people. I remember that place. It's precious to me. And the people whose lives touched me, Sister Cabey, Sister Plasto, Brother Bunyard. I remember these people. They're very precious people to me. They loved me so much. They nurtured me. They spent time with me. They talked with me. Just as you do in your lives in the church and outside the church. Because you make memorials for other people. You are a memory. You are part of somebody else's Christian walk. How you affect them and what you show them and teach them. There are people who will encourage you to do great things for God if you listen. They're part of your memorial God has given you. Do you ever stop? Do you ever stop and thank God for those people, those places, those circumstances, your memorials of your life? Because God says we're supposed to do that. God says, do something constructive. Make something that you won't forget what I have done in your life. Because I know people who God has healed and done incredible things. And in their times of sadness and despondency, all they can say is, where's God? He's not there for me. And they forget how he came through. They forget what he did for them before. And that's God saying, I know human nature. I know you forget. Make a memorial. Remember me this day. There's a very famous Baptist preacher named Criswell. You've probably heard of him. Passed away recently in Texas. He told this story. A story was told about him. When he was 10 years old, he went to a little church in Texas, and they had a revival meeting, which means they called in an evangelist to have a series of meetings. That's how the Baptists do it. And so they had this pastor, Johnny Hicks, come and speak. And he preached in the morning service, and he preached in their evening service. And one day that Pastor Hicks walked up to Criswell, the 10-year-old boy, and he took him and he walked him up the altar and prayed with him and led him to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And Criswell became a Christian. He became a Christian. He became a pastor. He became very famous. He wrote books, had a mega church. Criswell became an incredible person in this country as far as who's a Christian of great impact. And one day Criswell, many years later, was talking with a friend of his, a fellow pastor. in Dallas. And he was talking about his childhood conversion during that Johnny Hicks revival meeting at his church. And he went and he told about how, Criswell did, about how Johnny Hicks came to their home and ate with them and how he loved his mother's cooking and how this Johnny Hicks spent time with him and discipled him and talked to him about Christ. And that's how he went forward to receive Christ as a boy. And Criswell was talking to his friend, and his friend started shaking his head sadly. And he said, you know what? He said, Johnny Hicks, he said, just a few years ago, I visited him in the hospital. I visited Johnny Hicks at the Baylor Hospital in Dallas, and he was dying. And you know what he said on his deathbed, Johnny Hicks? He said, I haven't done anything for Jesus. Isn't that something? And that man died thinking he had failed God when he had been responsible for bringing a little boy who saved thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people with his message of Christ. And Johnny Hicks died thinking he was a failure for God. How wrong we can be. How little we understand that when we build memorials and when we share with the Lord, things move and people are affected and it goes on and on and on and people get saved and you don't even know the impact you've had as a Christian. Don't be that kind of Christian. Record it. Build a memorial. Make things that you can look back to and see. I've told you before, I've had people, the 20 years old, 30 years old, contact me on Facebook. They were in my Sunday school class when I was teaching. I was 16 years old, teaching junior boys, and they contact me and they say, Bob, did you know that I'm a missionary now? Did you know I'm pastoring a Nazarene church over here in Oklahoma? I didn't have a clue. I didn't know. And they thanked me for that teaching way back then. They're building a memorial they did not forget. And then you think to yourself, I didn't even know. I didn't know what had come from the fruit of my labors. I didn't know. But you may not know the effect you have had on people. You may not know those who have come to the Lord and done great things for the Lord because of your input and the time you took to talk to them. We must build those memorials. Lessons on faith are not just something that we can teach people. It's something you really have to experience to completely understand it. You have to live your faith. Don't just read about it. Don't just talk about it. Don't just think about it, but live faith. Live it. And by that I mean get out there in the trenches and pray and work and do things for God and build those examples of faith in your life where you see God do incredible things and you go, wow, look what God did. And then the next time you're feeling kind of down, you remember that. Okay, God did this last time. God will do it again. God blessed me before. He'll bless me again. God still remembers who I am. God still knows where I am. He hasn't forgotten me. And in the middle of this trial, I am with my God. There are also all kinds of mementos of the past. You know, if you were to come into my house or my office, you know, I have different things from different times in my life people have given me, and they remind me of this, a photograph, a little statue, a little present, this or that, and I remember, oh, the time I got that, and who gave that to me. They spark a memory when you look at them every time. Oh, yes, I remember who gave me that. Oh, yeah, I remember where I was. It's sort of like when you drive in the car and you hear an old song from high school or something, and you say, oh, yeah, I remember where I heard that song. I remember where we were. And, you know, I have several songs. If I hear them, I immediately remember a certain place and time in my life where I was. Memories are important. Mementos that we have in our life are important. And God knows how we think, and so he doesn't leave it to chance. He says, Joshua, make something substantial. Make something you can see. Do something where people can know. that I was here and I did something in your lives. Don't forget, Joshua. Don't let the people forget. Every time the Israelis would walk by that, they're going to remember God opened the Jordan River for us that we could walk through on dry land. We didn't do it. It wasn't our strength. It was Almighty God who opened the water and let us walk through. Secondly, the memorial stones were to serve as a basis of sharing faith with their children. In two places in this chapter, it talks about how parents have a responsibility to call to their children generation after generation. They need to speak to them. In verses 6 to 7, it says, that this may be a sign among you. When your children ask in times to come, what do those stones mean to you? Then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it passed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever. And again, in chapter 4, verses 21 to 23, and it says, and he said to the people of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in time to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall tell your children, you shall let your children know, Israel passed over the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan for you until you passed over. And the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up for us until we passed over. All through the Old Testament, there are memorials built at special times when God does something for people. The intention was to provoke thought in the future, for parents to remind their children what God had done. It's been said, and it could be very true, that Christianity is never more than one generation away from extinction. In one generation, the people could turn on God. And if we're not careful in this country, America will be exhibit A of a country that left God and forgot God. I think each of us sees more and more frequently the attacks on Christianity, the attack on Christian beliefs, where we're really down on the totem pole right now of who's important in this country when it comes to preferences. And we get trashed a lot, And these are just a few of the things in just this generation that happened. In 1962, they took the prayer out of school and said it was illegal. In 1963, they took Bible reading out of schools. In 1980, they declared it illegal to post the Ten Commandments in the school. When I was a little boy, all three of those things existed. I remember them. Boy, I'm old, huh? I remember in kindergarten praying before we had our milk and cookies and asking God to bless the food. I remember my teachers having Bibles right next to their dictionaries on their desks. And I remember the Ten Commandments posted on the walls along with other kinds of things like Hammurabi's Code and other laws of other cultures. And I remember teachers talking about them. And I remember there was some moral input into our lives as the teacher explained the Ten Commandments. Most people do agree that those are pretty good commandments to follow for your life. And there were others. They were just the Ten Commandments that they pointed to. But we looked at the laws that people have lived by in our lives. And today you can't do that. Today you'd be in big trouble. And I will say one thing about, at least, I work in the Norwalk La Mirada School District, and I will say we haven't gone bonkers yet. We're really quite friendly towards Christians in our schools here. Our superintendent is a Christian. Her father was a pastor, and works well for me. I forget what country she comes from. It's not Mexico. I think it's Cuba. I'm not sure. Cuba or Puerto Rico. But she came to this country not speaking English, and she learned English in an ESL class, so my job's secure. she speaks perfect English, and she's a great lady, and she does write us things and says, God bless you, and I'm praying for you, and things like that. So right now, I'm pretty happy in our particular school district, but I'll tell you, the attacks on kids, you can wear a T-shirt that says, I love Hitler or something, but you have something that says Jesus, and they send you home or make you turn your T-shirt inside out. And, it's just, there are schools that won't let a female teacher wear a cross necklace. I mean, that's not real blatant or out there or anything, but I'm telling you, we're going down a slippery slope really fast. And I pray for our country that this isn't the last great generation where we still have Christianity at work in our country. I hope not, because God says, build a memorial. God says, don't forget. He says, don't forget what I've done. And we are a culture and a community and a country full of incredible, great revivals where God came through and whole cities got saved. We have that heritage where God moved through the land and great things were done. And I hate that we would forget any of that. God says, build a memorial. Don't forget it. Don't forget it. And now we're just being told all the memorials have to be torn down because we show preference or something. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, 12 to 15, it says this, then take care, lest you forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, as we read. It is the Lord your God. You shall fear him, you shall serve, and by his name you shall swear. You shall not go after other gods, the gods of the people who are around you. For the Lord your God is in your midst, is a jealous God, lest the anger of the Lord your God be kindled against you, and he destroy you from the face of the earth. God says, don't forget who I am. God says, don't take the culture and the religion of these other pagan people. Purify yourselves. Follow my teachings. Do what I have taught you over and over again. And third, we have the memorial stones were to be a signpost to the lost world in verse 24. So that all the people of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, that you may fear the Lord your God forever. It's always been God's plan, and it still is God's plan that the whole world will come to know him. He's never changed that. It's still what he's seeking to do. When the world knows him, he will return. He wants the world to know him, that he is the only living and true God. And not only just the crossing of the Jordan, which was a great event for the people of Israel, but remember, it was also a terrifying event for the people of Canaan. Because while the Israelis are coming through rejoicing, the river's been parted, we're walking through into the promised land, the Canaanites are saying, oh my goodness, here they come. Their God came through. We thought the river would protect us. Here they come, another miracle. We also need to remember that it was a time of renewing personal commitment. We talked about how the priests went in and they all took a stone and they made an altar at the edge of the river. But there was another thing that happened that's very interesting. And the people of Israel, verse 8, did just as Joshua commanded. And he took up 12 stones out of the midst of the Jordan, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, just as the Lord told Joshua. And they carried them over with them to the place where they had lodged and laid them down there. Now, the priest had gone and, not the priest, but the 12 leaders of the 12 tribes had gone and taken the stones, but so did Joshua. But Joshua did something different. Not only did he tell the people, these 12 men, to go do that, but then he personally walked into made a journey back to the riverbed himself. And it says, And Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan himself, in the place where the feet of the priests bearing the ark of the covenant had stood. And they are there to this day. After the leaders took the 12 big stones and made an altar at the edge of the river, Joshua went back into the river himself, still on dry land, and he set up a memorial himself in the middle of the river of 12 stones. So some are going this way and one's going that way. Why? Why did Joshua do this? Joshua did this by himself, a very private act of one man. You know what? Sometimes when everybody else is doing something, we need to do our own thing. Sometimes, one thing's going on, we need our private moment with God. And while everybody else is building one altar, Joshua, who's experienced the power of God, who's heard the voice of God telling him to do something, and he has obeyed God and he has done what God spoke to him to do, he says to himself, I need to make my own personal altar, that I may never forget what God has done in my life. It's great that the nation is building an altar that the nation will never forget. But I, Joshua, am overwhelmed by the presence of Almighty God, and I too shall make my own memorial, and I will place it there in the middle of the river. Friends, we need our own private moments with God. It's so important, our own private moments. Once the 12 men had taken those stones to the side, Joshua takes his to the middle of the river. He commanded the priests to finish crossing the river with the Ark of the Covenant. And then we see in verse 15, and the Lord said to Joshua, command the priests bearing the Ark of the Testimony to come up out of the Jordan. So Joshua commanded the priests, come up out of the Jordan. And when the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord came up from the midst of the Jordan, and the soles of the priests were lifted up onto dry ground, the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and overflowed all its banks as before. When the ark was taken out of the river and the priest's feet hit upon the banks of the river, the water flooded back in. It was a time of personal renewal and commitment. And it was also to be a time of rolling away old defeats. Do you have some old defeats in your life? Some things that come up and bother you? Verse 19 says, the people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month, and they encamped at Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. And those 12 stones that they took out of the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. It's significant that this happened on the 10th day of the first month, and that is exactly 40 years to the day since Israel had marched out of Egypt. 40 days, a time of completion in the Bible. 40 years, a time of completion in the Bible. That is what the number 40 represents in the Bible. And leaving the edge of the river, the Israelites went to a place called Gilgal to make their camp. This is on the eastern border of Jericho. Gilgal means this: the reproach has been rolled away, or your shame has been rolled away. 40 years of spiritual defeat, 40 years of failure has been rolled away now. And this is the beginning of a great new day for the people of Israel. The days when people refuse to respond to God under Moses, like the Pharaoh, those days were gone. The days of complaining were ended here. The hopeless wandering around was finished. They were now at their destination. Now we have the Israelis who have an incredible sense of purpose. Before, they were about leaving Egypt, and they got pretty messed up and confused and wandered around a while. But now they're at Canaan land, and now it's time to go forward into a new territory that God has given them. Today we can look back as Christians. We can look at the monumental times, incredible times where God has come through for us and done a wonderful thing for us. And we can see those times that stand out in our lives, those times God did what we needed him to do for us. A time when we were bold, a time when we did what needed to be done, and we didn't think of ourselves, we remember what God needed done, and we did it. It's time to step forward as a child of God and say, a new day is in front of me. A new time is there for me to go forward into. The monument that I have built in my life, that I can look back and remember the things that God has done. A reminder of his faithfulness to me. All of that. I look at it. I remember what God has done for me. They built a monument in the middle, and then the waters came and overflowed. What monument are you building in your life? Have you started to ask yourself that question? What monument are you building for your children to remember, for your spouse to remember? What do you remember about the things that God has done in your life? You know, God will put you through some trials. You're going to go through some difficult times sometimes. Sometimes we go through the fire to be refined. The Bible tells us that. And that refining can be a painful time sometimes. Fire is not fun. But when we are being refined, we are making more pure and more great. And God can do incredible things in our lives, but he's there with us, seeing us through to the end. Everything you're doing is there for God to remind you. Jesus Christ is there for you. Jesus walks beside you. As we consider this morning these things that God has done in our lives, we come to the communion table. And at the communion table, Jesus said, what? Do this in remembrance, memorial. Do this in remembrance of me, because the greatest and grandest memorial of all time was Jesus Christ rising from the dead, defeating sin, defeating death as he died for us on that cross and yet rose again 3 days later, defeating death. That is our greatest memorial of all time. And Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me. Remember my blood. Remember my body. Don't forget, he said, what I have done with you. It was important enough to Jesus to be one of the last things he said to his friends. Don't forget. God knows human nature. God knows how fast we forget the good things he has done. I challenge you, build your memorial. I challenge you to write down, to think about it today. Go home and think about the good things God has done for you. Write it down. Go over it. You will rejoice as you remember the times he's touched your life, the times he's answered prayer, the times you grew stronger in him, the people he brought into your life that changed you, the places where you had great experiences with God. Do not forget. Jesus says, don't forget. Do this in remembrance of me.